The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. I want to take a minute this morning to welcome all of you to our first webinar of 2020. I'm Ann Heron, I'm SLA's CI Division Chair for this year, and I'm very excited as we're kicking this off with a superstar duo. We have our very own CI Fellows, Cynthia Chang Korea and Dr. Craig Flesher. Liz will take some moment to actually introduce them and give a little more on the presenters today. But I wanted to take a minute as chair to introduce our board for 2020. We have an excellent group of executive board members as well as a large committee member base. We actually have 18 total fabulous volunteers, exciting group of 5 new volunteers and 8 returning excellent group of folks to work with. So I'm not going to take a lot of time other than introduce them by name and position. So if you hear any familiarities or you're looking to reach out to anyone, you'll have at least that knowledge in the back of your mind. So again, our executive board is Chair Ann Heron, past Chair JP Brodchek, Chair-elect Phil Britton, Secretary Kavina Ladoro, Treasurer Jen Swanson, Communications Chair Megan Campbell, Content Chair Liz Frickleton, who will be leading us today, Membership Chair Kate Vilches, and then we have our committees as well. So our Content Committee, I'm not going to go through all the positions and names here, but we do have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the Content Committee. Our Communication Committee consists of 4 volunteers, and our Outreach Committee is, again, 3 volunteers returning from last year. So we're very excited for a robust programming this year, as well as some other great networking events. I will turn this over to Liz to start off, and looking forward to a great presentation today.
Indeed. Thank you, Ann. And it's a pleasure to be here with you. My name is Liz Frickleton, and just wanted to take a moment to say that at Aurora WDC, it is our privilege to sponsor today's webinar. We're busy getting ready for our annual conference. This is Reconverge G2, and our 2 Minneapolis-based co-chairs have put together a phenomenal meeting planned for April 21st through 23rd in Madison, Wisconsin. And with Reconverge, you can expect a productive, memorable meeting where our teams gather to address a unique business problem. They work through exercises to solve that problem and come away with an actionable growth plan. So if you're interested in getting more details, just head to reconverge.net. We really hope to see you in April. But before we get started, a couple housekeeping notes to share with you. You're no doubt here to learn and grow, so why not take your knowledge to the next level? The registration is open for Intel 01. This is a course actually led by our presenter today, Cynthia Chang Korea, and it's titled Competitive and Decision Intelligence, Essentials and Current Practices. It's set to begin, it's been condensed recently, so it's set to begin January 28th, that's next Tuesday. It's, as I mentioned, condensed into a 2-week format, so it'll run the 28th through February 7th. And you can get more information on that at sla.org. Just click that Learning tab, and you'll find it there. As I said, we're lucky enough today to have with us 2 of the Council of Competitive Intelligence leaders, Cynthia Chang Korea and Dr. Craig Fleischer. Did you know that in 2019 that SLA CID launched a mentorship program in partnership with the CI Fellows? Well, we intend to build on that partnership and feature the CI Fellows as speakers throughout our 2020 programming for webinars, so please stay tuned. As I mentioned, Craig and Cynthia are a very sought after duo in CI. We've asked them to return. They've given this presentation last year, of course, and as part of our annual conference programming too. So with that, I'd like to introduce Cynthia first. So we'll go one slide back there, who is the president of the CI Fellows and managing director of Knowledge Inform, a competitive and commercial intelligence consultancy. Presenting alongside Cynthia today is Dr. Craig Fleischer, as I mentioned, colleague at Aurora WDC, where he serves as Chief Learning Officer, as well as Vice President of the CI Fellows. Just want to thank you both again for being here today. And with that, I'll turn the floor over to you, Cynthia and Craig.
Thanks so much, Liz and Anne and everyone who's helped us get here behind the scenes. And we're really pleased to be here. And I just wanted to introduce the Council of Competitive Intelligence Fellows briefly. We are an educational nonprofit organization comprised of members who have demonstrated service to the intelligence discipline in the following ways: as ambassadors, champions, mentors, and educators. And so I encourage you to follow us on Twitter, as well as join our LinkedIn group, and you can see the handle and the names below to stay on top of goings on, and as well as the various types of educational opportunities and resources that we have to offer. And as Liz has mentioned, we partner often with the SLA-CID. So, the mentorship program is one of them. These webinars, are that as well as conference presentations at the annual conference and so forth. So we're really pleased with our partnership and being able to support the efforts of the CI division and its members. So thank you. And I just also want to mention too that Craig is Vice President of the Council, and so we are partners in crime, not just in terms of the 2020 series that we present, but also in our efforts to lead the Council towards meeting its educational mission. And so with this, I just want to set things up, and then we'll bring Craig in, where where we're at right now with this webinar is really a part of this long series, a multi-year series, I think beginning in 2017, early 2017, where we're looking at 2020, the year 2020, and how we can prepare for this decade that we're in now. So we've had these ongoing conversations as a part of Council and SLA-CI division, Skip Europe, and SLA annual conference presentations and webinars. So we've been building on this over time. And where we've been is talking about the what's ahead for CI, what's ahead for info and knowledge practitioners and professionals. And we feel that now we're into the decade squarely. It's time for us to really think about the how. How are we going to do this now that we have more of an understanding? In the past, we've talked about the various types of dimensions and changes that will occur, from AI to social changes to future of work changes that will inform how we will work and how we should be thinking about that. Also, where our organizations are, where various types of industry and macro environmental shifts will be. And so it's time for us to really, roll up our sleeves and start preparing. So that basically takes us to this, and we'll explore some of these questions. And with that, Craig, do you want to take us there?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And it's good to finally be in 2020, since we've been talking about it for 3 years. But we are going to be looking ahead, and that's something that's indicative of intelligence professionals everywhere, always trying to look ahead and over the horizon, and even around the corner. And that's been kind of our goal, working with the SLA-CI division for so long. And we're really excited to be doing it even further. And that's really going to kind of start today. And I'm excited. And there's a place for, there's almost 150 attendees on with us on the webinar today. And you have a part in this. So one of the things we're going to be doing, as you will see very shortly, is asking you a number of polling questions. Those polling questions are part of our conversation, which means you're part of our conversation. We're always using these kinds of sessions. For anyone who's been to one of ours, either at one of the annual meetings or on a prior webinar, you'll know that we always try to also query our crowd. And for those of you who have questions or maybe want to send us a chat observation, don't hesitate to do that as well. So we're going to be looking ahead, obviously. We're going to think about some of the challenges and opportunities, frankly. Actually, I'd argue there's, it's the two sides of the same coin. Those opportunities are large, as are the challenges. We're going to talk a little bit about technology, although not overemphasize it today. And maybe most importantly, for those of you who are attending, especially for those of you that may be earlier in your careers, this may be a great opportunity to kind of think about your professional growth and development plans. And for those of you who are thinking ahead towards the duration of this decade, I'm trying to understand, how you might be able to find your sweet spot in the field, or whatever the field may be called, is going to be a critical kind of task that kind of warrants early and often attention. So on that note, if we could go to our next slide. And we're going to start with the first of the polls that I was just alluding to. So the question here, again, as you can see, is do you have a clear view or understanding of our professional requirements over the next decade? And we've given you 4 options that you'll see on your screen, I sure hope. And if you can go ahead and actually select one of those for us, it'll start to tally up. And while those of you in the audience are doing that, Cynthia, do you have a kind of sense what you expect to see once those results are tallied up?
It's hard to say, because as much as, we get into the heads of managers when we conduct management analysis, it's hard to say, I think, what our participants are feeling and thinking about this. And I know you and I have had conversations about some of these answers and what they mean. But I would think that most of us will probably, well, I don't want to bias it.
So while she's doing it, here we go. All right. So we have a winner, it appears. And I'm not surprised, Cynthia. I kind of thought that somewhat response was likely to be the dominant one, and it does appear that way. I do see, however, I'm a bit surprised, and I certainly, if these folks want to add a comment in the chat window, I'd certainly appreciate hearing it. We do have 6% that do have clear views or understandings of our professional requirements, and for those of you in that 6%, congratulations. I'm assuming you must have done a lot of kind of deep thought and research about it. Having that certainty, if you have that, as it sounds you do, means you really have one choice, and that means to act on it. And that's great. So, for those of you who are in that, it's a smaller number. I admit it's the smallest one of the 4 categories that we have. But for those of you in it, do act, take those leadership roles, make sure you execute your plans. And, certainly we wish you all of the luck of kind of getting there ahead of other folks. It might actually be an asymmetric advantage for you to have that level of understanding already. Cynthia, what about you? Anything on there that either surprises you or maybe came in where you expected it?
Well, I have to admit, I cannot see the poll for some reason. So I'm glad that you're actually doing the readout for me. I'm flying blind a little.
Well, I'll go ahead and I'll jump in real quick. So we had 6% at yes. 50% said somewhat. Almost 30%. We had 29% at no, and then we had 15% that were unsure.
This is interesting because I think it tracks a bit with a conversation we had when we were constructing this poll. We took some careful consideration on how we wanted to do this, and one of the things we were clear about is to not include the word certainty. And we'll talk more about that later. But the other was that we actually polled each other. Craig and I asked each other where we landed, each of us, and I landed on somewhat, and Craig, you landed on unsure. Was that right?
That's right.
Yeah, because I think Craig and I think we tend to share the same approach to our practices, which is that we want to ensure that that we're always open to questions, and so we're always infusing a bit of a sort of an uncertainty, if you will, in our own approach, so that we can keep pursuing, I guess, some of these answers and trying to gain more clarity as a part of our practice. So while so for example, I can be quite clear about professional requirements, I still want to be open and flexible to new inputs, because we can bet that it will change, and we'll talk more about that later. Hey, Craig, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I think what you're referring to, I hope I'm not inferring too much into this, but what Cynthia is actually talking about is one of those functionalities and capabilities that I suspect is going to grow greater in prevalence for those of you who are kind of moving up and out. And by out, I mean outwards in terms of, scope in the field and being able to make kind of broader and deeper contributions. And that's foresight, or what we kind of call futures science or studies. And, I see that as being critical. And actually, it informs both Cynthia and my approaches in that, we like to keep our options open, that we like to think about alternate futures and, multiple scenarios, and being able to apply some of the foresight methodology that I believe is growing in prevalence and probably also in significance within the the field that kind of intersects between CI and information professionals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it leaves you open to new emerging paths that you may not have seen initially, so that you're not caught blindsided because you thought it might track in one direction, but in fact it hasn't. And so folks in the audience who've been through the CI Certificates Program course Intel 12 or scenario analysis understand this very well. So we have mechanisms actually built into our frameworks and models that help to ensure this, and we'll share some of this with you as well in a more distilled way in a few more slides. But let's take another poll here and move on to poll 2. Before we get into more of the meat of the discussion. And over the decade, the biggest forces impacting information and intelligence practices will be technical innovations, socio-political uncertainties and drivers, geopolitical. And I know that I think the polling mechanism in this webinar doesn't allow for some of these other choices, so we basically skip to other. So just choose what you have according to the polling platform. So if we could open up the poll, that would be really helpful for folks to begin to dive into these.
I like this question. This question really gets us to focus in on that macro environment. And I know anybody that's been having conversations about where things are headed, they ordinarily start out there, and there's no shortage of data and information to apply to those kinds of questions. Actually, I'd argue it's that no shortage that creates great opportunity for any of us in this field. Now, the bigger problem, it strikes me these days, is trying to filter through that deluge of data and information and trying to make sure that only the good stuff gets through. And that's been a challenge, obviously, for information professionals and CI pros for much of the last decade. I'd argue it's obviously coming into this decade. Maybe that was the primary challenge.
Yeah, and I want to also go back to the title of this presentation, right? It's the subtitle, or the Seeing Eyes, right? Peering over the 2020's horizon. And as you can see here, this is just a representation of all the dimensions that we can look at. And so there is a lot to be seen. Each one of these dimensions is really it can be a mega study unto itself. And so it's really important that we prioritize and train our eyes into some of these priority areas first, and then we begin to flesh out more of the landscape that we're interested in looking at. And so when we present these choices, this is just a sampler. This is by no means exhaustive, but as it is with anything large scale, we have to start somewhere, and we start with what's near and important, and then we take baby steps, right? Incremental steps, towards fleshing out the rest of this, and so we'll be following that approach for the rest of our discussion as well.
Cynthia, this also kind of reminds me, and I see the results just came through, and for those who can't see it, it's not, again, another one that's not even close. Most of you think the biggest force that will be impacting information and intelligence practices will be technical innovations. That's over half of you at 54%, with the second largest group being there at 28%, and that's focused on social and user expectations. So Cynthia, this doesn't surprise me, and I'll give you 2 reasons why I'm not surprised. Number one is something I know you and I have a lot of discussions about, because it impacts a lot of the practices that you and I interact with in our field, and that's called the availability bias. So
Yep.
availability really says, and this is one of the many cognitive biases that folks in our field often confront as they're doing their day-to-day work. Availability says the things that we tend to see most and we hear about most, or that are deluging our social media, those are the ones that we're going to focus on first. So seeing technical innovations, things like artificial intelligence and machine learning certainly comes in. The fact that we're going to have much faster communication through things like 5G, the use of geolocational information systems within the kind of intelligence toolkit, and being able to auto build taxonomy and things like that. All of those kind of technical innovations that are still to some degree, at least in our field, some degree they're embryonic. I don't want to suggest they're not present. And just to be perfectly transparent, I know back in the 80s when I was first kind of formally getting into the CI field, we were actually doing research around the interface of artificial intelligence and competitive intelligence. So it's not new, but what is new is the ability of our data sets and our tool sets to actually produce the kinds of outcomes that allow us to be more productive. And that's been a major shift over the last couple of years, and there's no reason to think that shift isn't going to continue happening over the next decade.
Absolutely, and I think, but also just full disclosure, we did construct this as a bit of a trick question, right? Because we forced a single choice, when in fact many of these are related. We can see this really as as various facets, of an ecosystem, right? Because tech innovations affects socio-political uncertainties and user expectations and so forth, and those expectations also are linked to political drivers as well, and the workplace, and so it's important for us to recognize that it would be artificial otherwise, as we had forced you to choose one of these. And so I think for those of you who chose other, I think that it would be interesting to hear via chat if you chose other because you felt that it was more than one, or if you felt that there was something completely completely out of this list that you felt should have been on this list. And so please feel free to share that as well. And so with that, let's dive right in. Oops, sorry about this. Hang on. There we go. And so we have a rather simplistic model, but I think it's a great start, to represent elements that are part of this constant and rapid change that we're in over the next decade and beyond. And so you can see we've placed info and intel squarely in the middle there, and we've plucked a few these sort of pillars to focus on, and starting with tech and innovations, because that is at the top of mind. Yes, some of it is according to Craig is saying, it's an outcome of the availability bias, because it's in the news so much, so it's top of mind. But the other is that it's very much a reality to what info pros are doing. A lot of the repetitive work has become automated and will become automated. Simple analysis continues to be automated as well, and so we really do need to be looking more closely at what those implications are to how we will be working and how our users will be working and their expectations down the line. And then there's the future of work. And so that basically is a sort of a blanket category that covers all different facets, of how our various types of stakeholders around us are working within organizations that we serve. And then there's also a macro element to this too. It's not just about our organizations, but also just the workplace in general and some of the drivers that are changing that. So in the past, there was a lot of buzz about telecommuting and how to manage that and so forth. And there's still a bit of that, but there are also other dynamics that will be in play as well, that affects this. So that's another element that we plucked. And then user expectations. And so we can't ignore this aspect of a discussion for this audience, right, for our audience, because we are so user focused in info and intel. Now, if we were talking about other functions, within in an organization, like R&D, for example, it's less of a facet for us to feature like this, but it is an important one, and it also does roll in a bunch of other elements, like we say, like as I mentioned, with tech and innovations affecting user expectations and also user habits too. So you have generationally different generations working differently and expecting different outcomes and applications, for tools, and quite frankly, their colleagues as well, and even their employers. And then finally, the VUCA environment, which stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment. And this is a term that's used very often in foreign policy, in government and military circles, and even some industries, because it captures the dynamics that are happening in the environment that we're in now, the global environment that we're in. And even domestically, one could say too, where we're dealing with questions, that present greater uncertainty, and with greater uncertainty, we need more tools to help us get closer to understanding what those various types of elements are, and also what the overall environment means to us. And so with that, I just could briefly talk about the four corners. What you see in orange there are just basically some elements that that touch on the bubbles, the circles that's near, and so you'll see that methods and tools touch on the tech innovation and future work, and social factor relates to the future work and user expectations, and for perceptions and reality, well, VUCA is the reality, but sometimes users may not understand that, and so there may be a disconnect there. And so it's really important that that we understand what those gaps are in order to be able to assist our users, our teams, our organizations. And then there's the overall macro environment, which arguably could cover all of this, right? But the macro environment would be things like those elements of the steep or pest analysis, so social and technological and economic, environmental and political and so forth. And so so with that, I'm going to take a step back and turn it over to Craig, to comment on this, and we'll continue.
Yeah, thanks, Cynthia. People looking at these and any kinds of analytical methods, and that's something that you and I do a lot of our work with. Always wonder, well, what does this mean for me, and kind of where do I start? So let me give a suggestion where I would start when I kind of think about all these constant and rapid changes moving ahead. The place that I would generally recommend folks start is in their mindsets. And for those of you that are familiar with some of the recent research on mindsets, one of the most kind of enduring concepts that has come out of the last 2 decades of that research looks at growth and fixed mindsets, and that's the work by Dr. Carol Dweck, who really helped us to understand that mindset matters. So for those of you that are really looking to grow and to improve and to kind of continuously enhance your capabilities, having a growth mindset is going to be important, and that growth mindset is going to be focused on things like your beliefs about the future, your beliefs about the challenges, your ability to be able to respond to changes in the environment, how you actually address kinds of so-called crises that arise. And then I'm going to give you 2 others that I think are going to be most important for practitioners in this space. Number 1 is, do you have humility? I think humility is critical in this. For those of us that are in advisory kinds of professions, like information professionals and intelligence professionals are, being able to understand that you can't know everything, that you don't know everything, and that you need to be not only asking yourself better questions, but certainly asking those you're working for better and more questions as well becomes critical. Folks that aren't humble are going to struggle, I will argue, in the decade ahead, much as I think, and I at least have some preliminary research to suggest they struggled in the last decade. And the other one is courage. So humility and courage. You need courage to act upon what you what you don't know, and the courage to not to be kind of paralyzed by your analysis, the courage to to learn, the courage to grow, the courage to be vulnerable. All of those pieces, I think, are going to become critical. And they're all part of that mindset that I'd argue is probably the best starting point to focus on as you begin to digest a model like the one Cynthia has on the screen now.
Yeah, I love that you brought up mindset, Craig. In fact, it's, those in the audience who've been through the CI certificate, or the CI Competitive and Decision Intelligence Certificates program. Have mindset drilled into them, and we've actually built upon Dweck's sort of approach to mindset, to expand that to include the intelligence mindset, right? So in addition to the growth orientation, in which you're questioning and learning perpetually, really, we're also looking at this from really more of a holistic and intel perspective, trying to leave our information biases behind. And so with the intel perspective, we're also incorporating analytics and analysis, and constantly looking at new inputs, new information and data that's coming in, and asking, what does this mean against what we already understand? And that understanding is carried in the minds of the info and intel pro that's practicing this. And so that sharpens your perspective, so you're not reliant on the literature that you see, but that you are expanding upon that. And this is where models like this, and this is a very simplistic one, because there are other models out there that have more branches and so forth. But models like this, help us frame this so that it doesn't become overwhelming. It becomes much more manageable, and that helps with the courage factor too, right? Because when you can organize your thoughts, you can organize your analysis, and you can break this down into the dimensions that are important to you, your team, and your organization. It helps you feel more confident about what you're doing, and it minimizes the chances of being overwhelmed or being scattered. And then the other part of it too, in terms of courage, is to understand that while some of this may seem difficult to do, or maybe intimidating because you are dealing with uncertainty, it helps you get closer to that understanding. It helps you develop a greater sense of certainty. Not that you'll ever get there, right, because of humility, but it helps you get that much closer, so that you can use your findings as touchstones. And these touchstones too, you will continue to adjust as you get new inputs. And this way, you're helping to stay current, you're helping your users stay current, and this doesn't become an overwhelming task, and you can develop that confidence that you need to approach this. And so it's very much the approach that we take with the CERTS program, but also in the academic training that you and I have also done, Craig. It's very much in our DNA in terms of getting folks comfortable with this, and so that they can begin to feel that sense of comfort in delving into some complex questions and issues.
That's right. Mindset matters. And actually, I think it matters more than many of us realize. I'll just note as well, before we move on to the next slides, we're actually trying to move towards that kind of action orientation, is that this does happen, as you've described, certainly at the professional individual level, but the organizational mindset matters too. And again, if you can get an organization that, that values intelligence, that values, not knowing what it doesn't know and knowing what it knows, and going through that entire, kind of 4 cells of the Johari's box. If you have an organization that's curious and is willing to keep trying things, even if some of those things they try don't produce the results that, might have either been desired or expected, and you can learn fast from that, you've got a pretty good likelihood of being resilient enough to be successful moving forward in any case.
That's right. That's right. And a lot of the leading business leaders and leading thinkers follow that as well. They don't fear failure, and they just manage it well, and they mitigate their risks. But in fact, Jeff Bezos is quite famous for this, and you'll see these lists of sort of Bezos-isms, just as we see Buffett-isms out there, about how they work and think and their approaches and so forth. And there's a lot to this, because they don't suffer from analysis paralysis. Right, and so some of these principles, if you don't have those of your own to start, it's awfully handy looking at how others have practiced this, and adopt those that work for you and your own team and organizations as well. So this brings us to the next poll, right, Craig?
I think it does.
Yeah. So
here we go. Yep. So for poll 3, and we're going to be asking you, how should you in the audience actually prepare for these changes in the next decade? And here again, we're going to give you a limited number of choices, but please pick the one that you think is best descriptive of, your view. Cynthia, while they're doing that, again, I'm going to kind of toss that back to you. How would you answer this, and what do you kind of expect to see?
Well, yeah, I just hesitate to taint the pool with my thoughts and in all humility and everything else that we're sharing. But I will say that I think it's important for us to have the clarity of where we want to be, and towards everything that we're talking about, right? Gaining, that foresight, I think, is a good start. And it's okay if that's, where you want to be, just, to be situationally aware, to be aware of what's coming down the pike. Not everybody has to carve out leadership roles, right? And so I just want to say that there's no judgment here in the choices that you make. This is really a check-in, for us, as we go, and once we get the results, we'll talk more deeply about this. But Craig, what do you think?
Well, I'm not going to think as much now that I've been biased by the actual results. This one is very interesting. So at the top of our list is at 42% is maintaining flexibility, followed by 2 others that didn't score too badly. The second one is to help shape changes internally within their organizations or within industry and society more broadly. And then third was develop foresight and prepare accordingly at 21%. Now, what came in really low, and I'm not too surprised by this, were the 2 tails of our question. So number 1 at 4% is to follow trends and peers, and number 2 at all of 6% was to lead the changes. So now I'm going to comment on it. I did expect and suspected that most people would kind of bundle in the middle, and that is what happened. What I was hoping, maybe hoping against hope, was that there'd be a few more folks over there in the lead changes portion of the 5 choices. Again, this is one of those areas where mindset begins to kind of integrate with and combine with things like skill sets in particular. In order to lead changes or to shape changes, which were the last 2, and it is kind of set up in an evolutionary manner. Right. In order to do that, you're going to have to courageously seek out answers to a lot of the uncertainty or that VUCA that you face. And this is a supply and demand issue, I think, in one of the simple ways that I look at it. For many years, and for someone who's been in this field and teaching in this field and researching it for into my 4th decade now, I've always kind of worried about the supply side of what we do. How do I help myself? And back in the early days, that was really hard because most people went to the kind of conventional and traditional places to learn, and that was either kind of post-secondary institutions, or they would read books, obviously, or maybe they came to places like SLA, where you have a good association that was actually able to provide the content and subject matter expertise they actually needed. The reality is today you have many more options. The catch here is that not all of those options are of equal relevance and value. Some of those options might arguably be counterproductive towards people's ability to tackle kind of the evolution of what's going to happen in their work context over the next decade. Cynthia, what's been your kind of view on that?
Yeah, absolutely, and I want us to start by picking up on the point that you made, that the choices here really is a part of a continuum, and some of you may have already noticed this, and so you may land at this point, at one point of the continuum, say B, maintaining flexibility, but down the line, as you become more comfortable with some of the changes in the landscape and developing a deeper understanding of that, you may see more opportunities to then help shape changes. And once you're comfortable with that, you can be in a position of even leading some of these changes. Either you develop advising on innovations, maybe for the broader info and intel practices, or perhaps leading changes within your own organization, to help get them thinking and preparing for the future and for more for changes in competition. And so I think with that, let's take a growth mindset also, right, to the choices that we made today, understanding that this could very well change when we have a clear understanding of where we are, where things are going, and that's where the actionability comes in. I also feel too that I discussed this as we were preparing this, that for me, I think that everybody should be at sea level. We should all develop some sort of foresight and prepare accordingly, and B is actually built into that. So that preparation is really about the flexibility. But I do encourage our colleagues and fellow practitioners to try to develop that foresight, not just about the subject matter at hand, say for example where our industry is going, but where info and intel practice is going, so that we can be prepared in our careers. We can prepare our own teams and our own organizations, towards where it's tracking. And so at that point, you can assess, to see whether or not your opportunities or personality or professional goals, might lead you into D or E. But I do think that at minimum, I encourage people to develop that foresight, so we're not caught short-shrifted in thinking that technology is going to represent say, for example, be a facilitator, and not recognize that technology may also undermine what we do by replacing the more routine aspects of what we do. And so we saw this happening actually in the .com era, where with the advent of search engines, a lot of info pros got very excited about that, because, well, what's not to be excited about that? It opens up new vistas, towards information content and research. But many folks did not realize until it was too late that end users recognized that too, and they were under the false understanding that they didn't need researchers anymore. They didn't need info pros. And so we saw some awful effects from that before people started to wise up again, and our users realized that they really did need the library or the information center. So let's not find us there again, and the antidote towards that is C. If we can stay ahead of this, we can prepare ourselves, we can prepare our users, and we can prepare our professional community. So I'll get off my soapbox about that.
Yeah, and real briefly, I'd add there is a risk-reward relationship associated with those 5. And that risk, obviously, as you move from following trends and peers at A down to leading changes at E, each step of that, the risk does increase, kind of rung by rung, but so do the potential rewards. And this is where we get back to that courage idea we were just talking about a minute ago. For those that are, for those of you who answered E and, do want to lead those changes, and I truly believe, and I'm optimistic enough to think that maybe some of those are in SLA CID leadership. Thank you, Anne, for being the leader for this year. I know you're one of the people that definitely has those qualities to lead changes. But for those of you, again, who are thinking about that, it's going to take courage. It takes courage to lead, because leadership, always results in change. Hopefully that results in net beneficial change. But again, there's always going to be impediments, and there's going to be forces that are going to be barriers to that change. And there's no shortage of distractions out there today to take you off of your deemed course. So on that note, I'd like to go to the next slide if we could.
Yeah, and actually, I'll just add one other thing, because I really appreciate the fact that you brought up SLA CID, because leading change doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to lead change within our workplace necessarily, at least not maybe in the immediate term. But you can do that with our professional associations, and SLA has, I think, always presented a wonderful environment for that. And as a longtime member, I can appreciate it, so I think that that's a wonderful place to start if you're not ready to start anywhere else. And so that brings us to poll 4. So Craig, do you want to get us started?
Yep, I sure will. So this poll is going to kind of look at some of the, I mentioned earlier, we talked about mindset. Well, usually what comes after mindset are skill sets, and that's what this particular poll is going to look at. So over the next decade, which of the following competency dimensions are going to be the most important in performing your information or intelligence task? And here again, we've got 5 choices. So for those of you still on with us, and I see most of you still are, go ahead and give us your answer. And while you're doing that, this is an area that I think requires a lot of attention. Obviously for practitioners that are trying to make sure that they're growing all the time and becoming greater and greater contributors in their organizations. But for those of us that are caretakers. So obviously as CI fellows, Cynthia and I very much view ourselves as stewards in our field of CI and trying to make sure that it remains relevant and has a future. So these kinds of elements become quite critical to us. And again, I'm going to be curious to see where the audience kind of sits on it, but I can tell you they're very much associated with not only our professional futures, but also our fields.
Yeah, and it's important to note too that there are different types of competencies put together by different professions and different practice areas, and so this doesn't follow any particular one. We've extracted this as basically general competency dimensions that cross-cut. It includes SLA competencies, the knowledge-informed ones that we use for the CI certificates program, and others that are out there as well. So so it looks like results might be in.
I hope so. Oh, wow. Okay. Well, there we go. Number 1 at the very top is the one at the very top. Third of the audience, digital investigation and inquiry. Again, I'm not surprised by that. I did kind of, and again, I'm not a seer, and sometimes I'm reminded of the seer sucker theory that for every seer there is a sucker out there. We have technology at a quarter. We have client services and support also at a quarter. Personal and social learning was actually a little less than I was guessing it would be, down at 13%, and only 3% of you picked others. Now here's where Cynthia and I are gonna kind of disclose our own view of this. We both picked other.
Another trick question. That's because I think we're thinking holistically. And I think you and I, we're not just practitioners, but we're also instructors, and so I think it's very hard for us to pick a favorite out of these.
The one thing I will suggest to folks though in their organizations, this is another one of those places that for those of you that are members of SLA and for those of you that are professionals of any sort, being able to lead your organization in your subject matter areas of expertise, those topical areas in the body of knowledge, whether it's of the information management profession or the CI profession, kind of knowing where it's at and where it's going. You may be the only ones in your organization that actually either A, have that skill set or that competency, or B, can recognize the importance of sharing that skill set with others in the organization. So this is one of those areas I think that many of us can take leadership in. Because those skill sets need to be, how do I say this nicely? They need to be broadly distributed in order to really empower the organization to accomplish all that it's capable of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another aspect of this too that I want to point out is that in the scenario work that we've done, and I run scenarios on info and intel related practices just to see where it's going to be, because I got to be able to advise my students and clients. And so when we do this, it's important for us to understand that there intersects between these two. So A and B, it's probably best viewed as a Venn diagram. But also one of the things that we've surfaced too in some of the scenario work that we've done is to understand that technology is a part of the digital investigation and inquiry, and in some of the scenarios we've come up with shows that in the practice of digital investigation and inquiry, there will be a disruption because of the automation that we've already discussed a bit, and we certainly discussed in past presentations and conference sessions. And so with this, we'll see aspects of search and even aspects of inquiry that will be automated. And it seems counterintuitive to some degree, especially for those of us who understand the deeper ins and outs of this. But systems are becoming smart enough that it will be able to do a portion of this. And what's going to be required of us is to get beyond the basics, to basically manage these systems to ensure that they're working properly, and to also use these systems to free us up, to liberate us, towards more complex problem solving and complex thinking that's involved in this. And that's the human element that's not going to be replaced. And so it's really important for us, to see it from those perspectives in order to basically provide us, some long-term insurance, career and job security.
So I would just briefly, again, I realize we are starting to run low on time. I briefly note that, deep learning is a technological term that's attached to machine learning, which is also kind of a great complement of artificial intelligence. But that the human piece of that I think you're referring to is deep thinking. And that's something that I hope, because I have a feeling that's going to be required for CI or information management leadership in this next decade. So, being able to find ways to improve our ability to do deep thinking, I suspect, is going to be correlated with leadership.
That's right. We will be freed up through technology, or maybe forced through technology, to perform these higher order functions that technology will not be capable of in the near term, or even I think the midterm. And so I see, that some of our practice functions will be threatened. The higher order ones won't be. And so to prepare us for that, I think is a good course. And we've discussed that in past sessions, and we're certainly happy to elaborate on this too in our June session coming up at conference, and we'll talk more about that later. So let's get to the next poll. I'm sorry, let's get to the next slide. And so this next slide, I'll just provide a brief overview, which is that when we're talking about how we're practicing all the things that we're talking about, this type of foresight and awareness and so forth, we can break this down, distill this into three levels. And there are other ways of looking at this, but this is, I think, a nice, elegant, and simple way of presenting this. Where level one speaks to current awareness. So we can plot whether or not we are here at level one, which would mean that we're tapping expert perspectives, we're reading about those. We're also tapping into trends that are immediate or near term, and as well as issues that might be local or narrow in scope, whether or not it's regional or geographic or industry or professionally. And then yet others might find themselves landing at the situational awareness level, where they're not just tapped into expert perspectives, but thought leaders' perspectives, and they're looking further out along the time horizon, and they're looking at trends that are not just immediate but also projected. Their geographies tend to be broader, and industry scopes tend to be broader as well. And then the level three would be those who are entertaining and even crafting scenarios and alternate futures. And so they're tapped into what futurists are saying, all the different perspectives, and some of them competing perspectives about where different tracks are going, or what the future state might be, for certain practices or the world. Where they're looking at different types of scenarios and alternate futures that are generated by other bodies, the government or other industries and so forth, to gain those perspectives. And then they're also looking at trends that are more complex, mega trends, multi-dimensional perspectives, basically combining all the other trends in the lower levels, and they combine all of this towards a more global scope. They have a regional industry understanding, but they also understand what's happening, or they at least are gaining some insights to what's happening on the global level. And so I think it could be very useful to plot where you are and to decide where you want to go. And Craig, do you want to elaborate on this too, especially on those arrows,
Oh, absolutely. So again, to be real brief, you'll notice there's two-sided arrows in this, and that's because level one, some people think, well, I'm there, I've got that, my organization has current awareness, and then they kind of push it behind them and move on to level 2 and 3. Level one's necessary no matter what you're doing in information management or in CI. it's not going to go away. It's always going to be necessary. The other two are kind of necessary and sufficient. But the key point being here, again, you've got to be able to do all of those, and growth will allow for kind of the interaction. It's, for me, those arrows are kind of the mortar in between the circles of the Venn diagram. So absolutely, and that's going to be important. That level 3 in particular is, as we've talked about before, is the most complex one. It requires the kind of most sophisticated data sets and tool sets to be able to use them. And again, if you have the right mindsets and skill sets, and then you can combine those with the right data sets and tool sets, you've got the world as your oyster.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And it's not to say that you have a crystal ball, right? We don't, for those of us who are doing scenario work, but what we do have are touchstones. And so we can develop these touchstones, and we adjust them as we go, so that we know what we should be paying attention to, and we can help advise our colleagues and our decision makers that we work with, towards outcomes that are more certain, and even outcomes that they can actually shape. Right, because if you can anticipate some of these changes, well, you can help shape some of these, and well, that's why they're lobbyists. So, to distill that into something simplistic. So let's go to the next one, and which is that as we move along, this continuum towards actionability, it's important for us to continue to check up and check in with ourselves and with each other, right, with our teams, with our colleagues, and colleagues at SLA, not just in our workplace. How clearly are we seeing? Asking ourselves, what are we not seeing but should see? And those are the unknown unknowns that we want to try to surface. And you can really only do that with one another, right? Because by definition, we can't see it. And then how well do we understand what it is that's in front of us, and how can we, what can we do to prepare for these changes, and then by extension, what can we do to guide or lead these changes as well? And we're not going to answer all of these questions today. Part of this is to really set things up so that we can begin to delve into this more deeply in our annual conference. But I think it's important for us to start thinking about this in advance of that, and when we can do a deeper dive. Craig?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where we're going. The one thing I'll note, we've got to do this together. No one of us is going to be able to be successful alone. And the more that, the more responsibility we take on, and certainly the more power that we earn, if I can use that terminology. Hello, Spider-Man. We really do need to, understand how to interact and socialize and collaborate. For those of us that got into the profession because we thought, oh, this is great. I can do all this on my own. I can sit behind my screen all day. I have an office and a cubicle or whatever, and nobody need bother me. Well, that may not work very well. Actually, I'm going to argue it probably won't work very well at all as 2020 beckons and moves forward. So let's go to I think we've got our last poll question coming up here next.
Absolutely, yeah. So
we're going to end on.
Yeah. So do you feel adequately prepared professionally for the changes and conditions of the next decade?
I don't want to bias this any more than others, but yes, Cynthia and I have chatted about this. The next decade is going to be exciting for most of us. It's probably going to move faster than the last one did. Shouldn't surprise anyone. That level of VUCA that you ended 2019 with will be significantly higher, I predict, by 2029 at the same time on the calendar. All right, let's see where people come in on this. And thanks for those of you who've stayed with us. And again, we will have a little bit of time here at the end to hopefully answer your questions. No surprise, by far, the single largest result was somewhat at 58%, and the other three were relatively even with the yes, no, and unsure. Mm-hmm. Cynthia, what's your view on that?
Well, I think it's individual, and but I tend to skew towards it was a B and D, right? It's that humility factor. It's trying to remain open, because I feel that it's just really important, to that growth mindset. I think prevents me from saying yes, and that's just maybe my personal bias there. And you, Craig?
Yeah, well, I'd have you add to that. So, for those that are 13% in the yes and the 13% in the no, both of you should be compelled to take action. So for those of you that are in that yes and you're adequately prepared, please, take on the leadership roles that you're prepared to take on. And for those of you that are saying no to that, this is your challenge too. It's to get that professional preparation. It's to do that identification of your professional growth and learning plans, and to think about and to take development of your competencies to the next level. So you both have a charge ahead.
Yes, yes. And so with that, we'd like for you to share your assessments with us, via the chat. And with these assessments, we can also look at them according to individual, team, organizational, and in professional communities dimension. So that would be, say, SLA, SLA-CID. And I tend to like to break it down into these as well, so I can sort of run my own diagnostics on what we need to do, with each of these entities. But if you will, think about how prepared you feel, and what can you do to prepare, guide, and or lead. And we'll discuss more of this too at the SLA annual conference coming up. And our session at the conference is called Foreseeing the Future of Intelligence and Information Services. Are we prepared? How do we know? And so we'll build on some of these frameworks and tools that we've just been discussing. But in the meantime, it's really important that you think about this and in your day-to-day and so forth, and so that we can have a more robust discussion. Craig?
Yeah, no question. And for me, that kind of comes down to two things. Obviously, all those levels are going to be important. So, the two kinds of pieces I would get back to are, number one, exhibit humility and demonstrate courage. For those of you who are able to do both of those, we can't wait to see what you accomplish. Actually, I certainly, as an observer of the field, am looking forward to, to the many successes and achievements that information professionals and CI practitioners are going to be able to achieve over the next decade.
That's right. That's right. And so we look forward to seeing you in June, for those of you who can join us. And thank you very much for joining us today, with your time and your comments. And if you also want to reach out to Craig and me, our contact information is here. We also have our Twitter handle there, and the council LinkedIn group listed there as well. So please feel free to join us there as well. And thank you to the organizers, for helping us present, some of these ideas, and continue with our journey on the 2020 path. And we look forward to continuing in June.
We sure do.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Cynthia and Craig. Just wanted to thank everyone in the audience as well for being here today. And just wanted to let you know that we will be posting this recorded webinar on our SLA CID YouTube page. So you can find that in our whole library of webinars. We just, again, appreciate you taking your lunch hour to join, participate in the polls, Q&A, chat, all of that. And we look forward to seeing you again in February. We're still working on our webinar program for the year, but stay tuned to our social media channels to find more about what we've got planned in the coming months ahead. So let's have a great 2020. We'll see you all next time. Thanks.
Thanks, Liz. And I'd like to also add, if people have follow-on questions, please feel free to post it to our LinkedIn group, and Craig and I can follow up there.
We sure can, and will.
Absolutely. Great.
Thanks. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.